In the late 1990s, television news crews parked outside a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, their cameras fixed on a small procession moving up the steps. Among the group was a stocky, gray-haired man in an expensive overcoat, his eyes hidden behind dark-tinted glasses despite the overcast sky. The reporters knew his name from the indictment that had just been unsealed: Alphonse Malangone. Federal prosecutors were accusing him and others of quietly dominating New York City's commercial trash industry for years, using threats and behind-the-scenes pressure to keep prices high and competition low. To most viewers watching at home, he was just another unfamiliar face in a long-running story about organized crime. To investigators who had spent years tracking the city's entrenched rackets, he was something else, a symbol of how deeply the old Mafia families had managed to embed themselves in the everyday business of a modern American metropolis. The charges against Malangon did not involve headline-grabbing shootouts or spectacular robberies. They were about control: who picked up the garbage behind a restaurant in the Bronx, who hauled waste from a factory in Queens, which company got the contract, and which ones were quietly told not to bid. Prosecutors described a system in which carting companies were assigned territories, customers were steered and locked in, and anyone who tried to break the arrangement faced pressure that could range from lost business to explicit threats. It was, they argued, an invisible tax on thousands of small businesses across the city, extracted not through open warfare, but through a web of understandings enforced by men like Malangon. Newspaper stories noted his nickname, Ali Shades, a reference to his constant habit of wearing dark glasses. He was not a household name like some of the flamboyant bosses who had dominated tabloid front pages in the 1980s. He preferred anonymity, operating in an area of organized crime that was deliberately dull on the surface. But when state and federal investigators finally ripped back the curtain on New York's trash cartel, his name appeared again and again in wiretap transcripts and surveillance reports. For law enforcement, he exemplified a new kind of underworld figure, less a neighborhood strongarm than a businessman who understood contracts, routes, and profit margins, as well as how to bend them to the interests of a criminal organization. To understand how a man like Alphonse Malangone could rise to such a position, moving in the space between boardrooms and back rooms, it is necessary to step away from that courthouse scene and go back several decades, to the streets and tenements where his world was first formed. His story is not just about one person. It is about a particular time and place in American history, when immigrant neighborhoods, limited opportunity, and the evolution of organized crime combined to create a particular kind of underworld career. The man who would one day walk into court in a tailored coat and dark glasses began life in circumstances very different from those images. Malangon was born in New York City in the 1930s, during the tail end of the Great Depression, into an Italian-American community that had only recently begun to find its footing in the United States. His family, like countless others of similar background, belonged to a wave of southern Italian migrants who had arrived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, settling in crowded urban neighborhoods where the language on the street was a blend of regional Italian dialects and American English. These enclaves, stretches of the Bronx, East Harlem, and Lower Manhattan, were places of intense community life and hard realities. Rents were high, apartments were cramped, and work was often unstable, especially for those without connections or fluent English. In such neighborhoods, the basic institutions of community life were visible everywhere. The Catholic Church loomed large, not only as a place of worship, but as a center of social life. Parish festivals spilled into the streets in the warmer months, and religious processions wound past pushcarts and storefronts. At the same time, small family-run businesses lined the sidewalks: bakeries, butchers, grocers, and tailor shops, often run by recent arrivals who relied on extended family and countrymen for credit, labor, and protection. Children like Malangon would have grown up seeing long hours, frugality, and the constant effort to climb even a small rung up the economic ladder. Yet alongside these legitimate efforts, there was another presence in the neighborhood that could not be ignored. In the years before and just after Malangon's birth, what Americans would come to call the Mafia was transforming from loose gangs into more organized, structured groups. In New York, the bloody internal struggle between competing Sicilian and Neapolitan factions in the early 1930s had ended with a reorganization of power into what law enforcement later labeled the Five Families. These organizations, among them the network that would eventually be known as the Genovese crime family, saw opportunity in precisely the kind of neighborhoods where families like the Malangons lived. The men who represented these organizations at street level did not always resemble the cinematic image of gangsters. Many appeared as successful neighborhood figures. The well-dressed man who always seemed to have cash, the one who could pull strings at City Hall, or the figure seated in the back of a social club, greeting a steady stream of visitors. They sponsored church events, donated to local causes, and in some cases did provide a kind of rough and ready assistance to people who had nowhere else to turn. But their money and influence were rooted in gambling, loan sharking, and forms of extortion that quietly bled the same community they appeared to support. For a boy growing up in this environment in the 1940s, the lines between these different forms of authority could appear blurred. Respect in the neighborhood could belong to a hard-working store owner or to a man rumored to have connections downtown. Police presence was sporadic, and mistrust of outside institutions lingered from the experience of immigrant families who felt looked down on by city authorities. In that setting, the Underworld's code of silence, omerta, was not just an abstract concept but a practical rule of survival. Whatever one saw or suspected, it was understood that it was not wise to speak about it openly. The broader world beyond these streets was undergoing its own upheavals. When the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, Italian-American neighborhoods sent thousands of young men into the armed forces. Their absence changed patterns of life at home, and wartime rationing altered daily routines. At the same time, the war accelerated certain kinds of black market activity in big cities, as scarce goods created opportunities for illicit distribution. This environment reinforced a lesson already present in many working-class districts. There were always two economies running side by side, one sanctioned by the state and one operating in the shadows, often overlapping in ways that were not immediately obvious. By the time Malangon reached adolescence in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the post-war era was reshaping New York. The city was beginning to lose manufacturing jobs even as it grew as a center of commerce and finance. For many white ethnic groups, including Italian Americans, the period brought a measure of upward mobility, access to better housing, education programs, and the possibility, at least in theory, of moving out of crowded tenements and into the suburbs. Yet structural barriers remained, especially for those whose families lacked formal education or connections to established professions. In the neighborhoods where he came of age, high school graduation was not guaranteed, and many young men left school early to work and support their families. For those looking for work, certain sectors seemed particularly accessible: construction, trucking, food markets, and the waterfront. These were industries where physical labor counted more than formal schooling and where unions had a strong presence. They were also, increasingly, industries in which the five New York crime families saw opportunities. Through a mixture of influence over union locals, control of key companies, and the capacity for intimidation, organized crime became deeply entrenched in the everyday workings of how goods moved through the city: who loaded the trucks, who drove them, who collected the trash, and who unloaded fish, meat, and produce at the wholesale markets. The very industries that offered chances for upward movement to working-class Italian-American young men also carried with them exposure to organized crime. A job at a market might mean dealing with office men who quietly collected payments on behalf of a local mob captain. A position as a driver or dispatcher could bring a worker into contact with companies that were nominally independent, but in practice answered to a criminal hierarchy. It was in this world of interwoven legal and illegal arrangements that Malangon would eventually make his mark. Contemporary law enforcement documents that later surfaced in court cases provide only fragments of information about his early steps into this milieu. They do not describe a dramatic initiation or a sudden turn to crime. Instead, his name begins to appear in intelligence reports and surveillance notes in connection with individuals already identified as members or associates of the Genovese family. This suggests a gradual progression, first as someone on the periphery of underworld circles, then as a trusted intermediary in sectors that the family was keen to dominate, particularly those involving transportation and waste hauling. One of the few personal details consistently mentioned in reporting about Malangon is his nickname. By the time he reached middle age, he was widely known in underworld and law enforcement circles as Alley Shades or Alley Shades Malangon, a moniker attributed to his habit of wearing tinted glasses at nearly all times. Whether the glasses were originally a matter of medical necessity, personal style, or both, they became a recognizable part of his public image. For investigators watching him outside social clubs or courthouses, the dark lenses contributed to an impression of a man carefully guarding what he chose to reveal. The world around him was not standing still. In the early 1950s, the televised hearings of Senator Estes Kefauver's Special Committee to investigate organized crime brought the existence of a national underworld into millions of American living rooms. For many viewers, this was the first time they heard government officials openly describe crime syndicates and families that spanned multiple cities. But within the neighborhoods where those organizations had grown, the hearings produced more caution than shock. For groups like the Genovese family, the lesson was clear. Avoid overt public attention, stay out of the sensational crimes that attracted headlines, and focus instead on steady, less visible sources of income. This strategy played to the strengths of someone like Malangon. Instead of becoming a figure recognizable to the general public, he emerged within what might be called the managerial tier of the underworld, men who navigated contracts, front companies, and union relationships. Their activities affected the lives of countless ordinary people, but rarely in ways that would lead a small business owner or truck driver to know the names of those ultimately pulling the strings. To most, the system of route assignments, industry rules, and unspoken boundaries in the trash and trucking trades might seem simply like the way business was done. At the social level, men inhabiting this world often cultivated an appearance that blurred the line between legitimate businessman and criminal. In photographs from later years, Malangon is seen in suits that would not have looked out of place on an executive, his hair carefully groomed, his demeanor composed. Such presentation was not merely vanity. In a period when organized crime was increasingly subject to law enforcement scrutiny, the ability to move comfortably in legitimate settings, board meetings, labor negotiations, licensing hearings, was an asset. It also reflected a generational shift in parts of the Italian-American underworld from the rougher street style of early 20th century gangs to a more polished, business-like front. At the same time, the young men who moved into this stratum of underworld life did so against a backdrop of broader social tensions. Italian Americans were in the process of being absorbed into a larger category of white ethnic that would, over time, enjoy many of the privileges of whiteness in mid-century America. But lingering prejudice, especially in elite professions and institutions, meant that pathways into conventional power, law, finance, high-level corporate positions, were not equally open. For some, the nexus of union politics, Small business and underworld influence offered a parallel route to influence and material comfort, even if it carried its own risks and moral compromises. The harm this system caused seldom appeared as a single dramatic act. It was cumulative, the restaurant owner paying more for trash collection than a competitive market would have required. The honest carting company, not connected to any family, quietly pushed out of business. Workers learning to accept that certain questions about who ran things were never asked if one wanted to keep a job. For a man like Malangon, whose rise would be tied to precisely these kinds of arrangements, the early decades of his life coincided with the consolidation of a shadow structure that sat atop parts of New York's economy. By the time federal and state authorities began, in earnest, to develop tools like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act (RICO) in the late 1960s and early 1970s, this shadow system was decades old. It had adapted to political changes, law enforcement campaigns, and shifts in the city's economic base. The boys who had once watched the comings and goings outside neighborhood social clubs were now, in middle age, the ones sitting inside, making decisions. In that sense, Alphonse "Alley Shades" Malangone was very much a product of his time and place. His individual choices mattered, but they intersected with a set of pre-existing structures that had been shaped long before he reached adulthood. The public record remains relatively quiet on the intimate details of his childhood and youth, what schools he attended, which jobs he first took, the personal turning points that led him more deeply into the circles that would define his adult life. What can be said with confidence is that he came of age at a moment when organized crime in New York was moving away from the volatile street violence of its early years and embedding itself in the routines of commerce and labor. The neighborhoods in which he lived and worked were not just backdrops. They were training grounds in how power could be exercised subtly, through relationships, reputation, and economic leverage. Years later, when prosecutors would present charts in court connecting his name to companies, union locals, and fellow defendants, they were mapping a network that had grown gradually over time. Each line on those charts represented not only a business arrangement, but also the legacy of the world in which Malangon had been raised. A world where family loyalty, neighborhood ties, and an ingrained distrust of outside authority created fertile ground for organizations that thrived on secrecy. The boy born into a crowded New York Italian enclave would, as an adult, become one of the figures who helped extend that culture of silence into the seemingly mundane realm of trash contracts and trucking routes, setting the stage for the conflicts with law enforcement that would eventually bring his name into the spotlight. Years after the Second World War, as New York shifted from a manufacturing hub to a service and finance city, people like Alphonse "Alley Shades" Malangone were quietly learning how power worked in the spaces between those worlds. The factories that had once offered stable work to men without much formal education were starting to close or move, but trucks still had to roll through the city's streets, unloading food, hauling waste, moving goods from piers and warehouses to stores and restaurants. It was in this tangle of loading docks, freight yards, and back entrances that organized crime saw its chance, and where Malangon's adult life began to take on the contours that investigators would later describe in court. New York's system for dealing with garbage created an opening almost tailor-made for underworld influence. The city's Department of Sanitation handled residential trash, but commercial waste, the refuse produced by office buildings, restaurants, factories, and shops, was left to private companies. Dozens of small and mid-sized carting firms sprang up in the post-war decades, many of them rooted in the same working-class Italian, Irish, and other ethnic neighborhoods where Malangon had grown up. On paper, they competed freely for customers. In reality, a very different arrangement was developing behind the scenes, one in which competition was sharply limited, and critical decisions were made not in open bidding but in quiet meetings. According to later law enforcement investigations, by the 1950s and 1960s, the Genovese crime family had begun to see the commercial carding business as a reliable, low-profile source of income. Unlike gambling or narcotics, trash did not attract sensational headlines. It was a basic urban service, unglamorous and constant. Control did not depend on spectacular violence, but on relationships, with certain unions, with owners of small hauling companies, and with representatives of other crime families that also sought a piece of the trade. In this environment, a man who could move comfortably among neighborhood business owners, union functionaries, and underworld figures had considerable value. Public records do not give a step-by-step account of Malangon's earliest ventures into this world. The official paper trail in those years is sparse, offering only hints of his growing stature. What emerges, instead, from later prosecutions and journalistic accounts is a picture of a man who, by middle age, had positioned himself as a key intermediary between the Genovese organization and sectors of New York's trucking and waste industries. His rise was incremental, not a single leap into notoriety, but a series of small, accumulating decisions that bound him more tightly to a system rooted in coercion and control. In the post-war decades, the social clubs and storefront offices that dotted Italian-American neighborhoods functioned as informal headquarters for this kind of activity. They were often modest spaces, a few card tables, a television, framed photographs, perhaps a religious image on the wall. Men came and went throughout the day, some staying to play cards, others arriving for brief, hushed conversations before disappearing back into the city. These places were not secret in the strict sense. Everyone in the neighborhood knew they existed, but their inner workings were shielded by the shared understanding that what happened there was not to be discussed with outsiders. It was in such settings that connections were made and reaffirmed, and where someone like Malangon, with ties to both street-level workers and higher-ranking figures, could build a reputation. By the early 1960s, law enforcement agencies were beginning to pay more systematic attention to organized crime in New York. The FBI, prompted in part by the public embarrassment of the 1957 Appalachian meeting, at which dozens of underworld leaders were detained at a gathering in rural upstate New York, established specialized units to monitor the activities of the city's crime families. Local prosecutors, too, started to develop longer-term investigations into racketeering, particularly in industries where labor unions and cash transactions played a major role. In their intelligence notes and surveillance summaries, agents recorded the names of men who seemed to serve as regular points of contact in particular sectors. Over time, Alphonse Malangone's name began to appear more often, especially in connection with the Genovese family's interests in trucking and waste hauling. The methods by which organized crime insinuated itself into the commercial carding business were, on the surface, deceptively simple. Carding company owners would be encouraged, sometimes gently, sometimes with a clear edge, to join an association or trade group that, in theory, represented industry interests. Within that association, an unwritten rule would be established. Each company had property rights to its existing customers. Competing for another member's accounts was forbidden. Contracts were quietly carved up, territories informally divided, and customer loyalty enforced not only by service, but by fear of retaliation if someone tried to switch haulers. Prosecutors would later describe this as a cartel, a closed system that suppressed competition and kept prices artificially high. For this to work, there had to be trusted figures who could mediate disputes, assign routes, and make sure everyone understood and followed the rules. It was not enough simply to intimidate. The system had to be organized. Men with a reputation for reliability within the underworld, but also an ability to present themselves as plausible businessmen, were ideal for such roles. Law enforcement accounts from later decades suggest that this is where Malangon increasingly fit. As someone seen by the Genovese hierarchy as capable of managing relationships with carding company owners, resolving disagreements, and making sure that the property rights system operated smoothly in the areas under their influence. The setting in which he operated was not limited to trash alone. The same mix of trucks, loading docks, and perishable goods created opportunities in other parts of the city's distribution networks. Wholesale food markets, especially those for fish, meat, and produce, were particularly attractive to organized crime. They dealt in commodities that had to move quickly, with transactions often conducted in cash and under pressure. For decades, these markets had been vulnerable to strong-arm tactics, control over who got unloading jobs, who had to pay fees for the right to operate, which trucking companies were allowed access. Long before his name surfaced in indictments related to such places, the structures that would eventually connect him to them were being put in place. One of the most notorious of these hubs was the Fulton Fish Market in Lower Manhattan, a sprawling complex where, for generations, the city's fish supply arrived before dawn to be auctioned, purchased, and distributed. By mid-century, the market had become almost a textbook example of how organized crime could insert itself into a vital urban industry, taking advantage of congestion, time pressure, and the constant threat of spoilage to demand payments and dictate terms. The Genovese family, in particular, was repeatedly identified by investigators and journalists as the dominant underworld presence there. Though Malangon did not immediately emerge as a central figure in those early accounts, the pattern that would later link his name to the market was already developing: the blending of business operations with hidden, enforced arrangements. Back in the carding sector, the 1960s and 1970s were years of both opportunity and risk for someone in his position. On the one hand, New York's growing commercial base meant more waste to collect and more money to be made from long-term service contracts. As office towers rose and new restaurants opened, the volume of business available to private haulers expanded. On the other hand, shifts in city politics and policing brought periodic crackdowns on what officials bluntly referred to as mob influence in unions and key industries. The Teamsters and other labor organizations faced investigations, and public commissions issued reports condemning corruption. In this climate, underworld-connected figures had to operate with increased caution, using layers of front companies and intermediaries to shield their involvement. Accounts from former investigators emphasize that Malangon was not known for flamboyance. He did not cultivate the kind of media persona that some organized crime figures of the era adopted. There were no grainy tabloid photographs of him emerging from nightclubs with celebrities, no public proclamations. Instead, his reputation was built in quieter ways, among business owners who understood that he represented a power beyond any single carding company, and among underworld peers who saw that he could be relied upon to maintain order in a lucrative but potentially chaotic sector. The nickname, Alley Shades, rooted in his ever-present tinted glasses, marked him out visually, but he did not seek broader recognition. The harm imposed by the system he helped administer was often invisible to those outside the affected industries. A restaurant owner who found that every local hauler quoted nearly identical high prices for trash pickup might assume that was simply the cost of doing business in New York. A new company that tried to enter the market and undercut established firms might discover that trucks were damaged, drivers received anonymous threats, or licenses suddenly encountered bureaucratic obstacles. Because these pressures were diffuse and often unreported, the true scale of the problem could be hard for outsiders to grasp. But when prosecutors later examined billing records and contracts, they would argue that businesses across the city had been paying, year after year, a premium that flowed directly into the pockets of cartel-aligned operators, and through them, to figures like Malangon. Meanwhile, within the internal structure of the Genovese family, the post-war decades saw significant reorganization. After the death of boss Vito Genovese in 1969, power shifted among various figures, including acting bosses and street-level administrators, as the family adapted to the pressures of increased law enforcement scrutiny. In the 1970s and 1980s, Vincent Chin, Gigant emerged as the dominant leader, famously cultivating an image of mental instability to complicate prosecution efforts. Under his tenure, according to numerous court findings and expert testimonies, the family focused heavily on entrenched rackets that generated steady income: construction, gambling, union corruption, and control of markets and waste hauling. Within this strategy, individuals who could manage operations in these sectors effectively were of high value. Malangon, by then a seasoned participant, fit into that environment as a trusted manager of day-to-day matters in the carting and, increasingly, wholesale food sectors. By the mid-1970s, the economic crisis that gripped New York, a near bankruptcy that led to severe budget cuts and a rethinking of city services, had unintended consequences for the world in which Malangon worked. As municipal resources were strained, reliance on private contractors in certain areas grew, giving organized crime more room to maneuver in bidding processes and subcontracting arrangements. At the same time, the fiscal crisis weakened some oversight mechanisms, at least temporarily. It was a period in which a determined, well-connected operator could quietly expand influence while public attention was focused elsewhere, on the city's visible decay and the struggle to maintain basic services. Law enforcement agencies were not blind to these developments, but they often lacked the legal tools needed to address them comprehensively. Traditional criminal statutes were designed to prosecute individual acts, an assault here, a specific extortion payment there, rather than the sustained patterns of influence that kept a cartel functioning. Investigators would surveil meetings, identify the same faces, among them Malangons, turning up in connection with carting executives, union officers, and known mob figures, and struggle to translate that pattern into charges that could withstand courtroom challenges. It was this gap that Congress sought to address in 1970 with the passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, a law that would, in time, become central to the cases brought against the garbage cartel. In the short term, though, RICO's existence did not immediately transform the situation on the ground. Building a RICO case required years of patient investigation, wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and financial analysis. Through the 1970s, much of that groundwork was still being laid. To the ordinary observer, the commercial waste business appeared largely unchanged. The same companies collecting from the same businesses, the same unwritten rules about which hauler owned which customer. Behind that continuity were people like Malangon, ensuring that the system's internal discipline held firm, even as the legal environment began to shift in ways that would ultimately make his position far more precarious. It is striking how little of this activity penetrated public awareness at the time. When New Yorkers thought of organized crime, they were more likely to picture narcotics trafficking, high-stakes gambling, or violent feuds between rival factions, stories that occasionally erupted into the headlines. The slow, methodical siphoning of money from trash contracts or fish deliveries did not lend itself to dramatic coverage. Only specialists, prosecutors in organized crime bureaus, detectives in labor racketeering units, a few investigative journalists, fully grasped the extent to which large segments of the city's infrastructure were, as one prosecutor later put it, taxed by a criminal system operating in parallel to the official one. By the late 1970s, however, the cumulative effect of years of investigation began to focus attention more sharply on the industries in which Malangon operated. Reports commissioned by the city examined the cost of commercial carting and found patterns that were difficult to explain in purely market terms. Academic studies of labor racketeering highlighted the role of organized crime in trucking and waste disposal. Incrementally, what had been understood in certain neighborhoods as simply the way things were done started to be recognized more widely as a form of organized economic coercion. Within law enforcement agencies, Individuals who had spent years tracing the connections in these sectors were preparing to make more ambitious use of the legal tools now at their disposal. For Alphonse Malangone, this meant that the landscape he had navigated for decades was about to change. The habits and relationships that had sustained his rise, deals made at social clubs, understandings enforced through reputation and occasional threats, the blending of legitimate business decisions with criminal directives, would increasingly be tested against an investigative approach that looked at patterns over time rather than isolated incidents. His name, long familiar within certain specialized circles of detectives and federal agents, was on the way to becoming more broadly known, as prosecutors began to target not only street-level enforcers, but also the men they described as organizers and overseers of the city's underworld-controlled commercial systems. As the 1980s opened, New York City carried two very different images of itself. One was the official story, a metropolis struggling out of the fiscal crisis of the previous decade, gradually stabilizing its finances and beginning to see new towers climb over a battered skyline. The other was less visible, understood mainly by people who moved in certain industries or worked in law enforcement. In that version, the city's recovery was taking place alongside an entrenched underworld presence that quietly taxed the movement of goods and waste, draining money from thousands of businesses through systems that looked, on the surface, like ordinary commerce. It was in this second New York that Alphonse Malangone had become an important figure. By now, he was no longer a young man on the fringes of neighborhood rackets. He had spent years building relationships in trucking, waste hauling, and wholesale markets, sectors the Genovese crime family had identified as stable sources of income. His name turned up in surveillance reports, on lists of phone numbers recovered during searches, and in the recollections of witnesses who described him as a man who could straighten out problems over routes and contracts. While public attention focused on spectacular cases involving drug trafficking or headline-grabbing murders, people who studied the economic side of organized crime came increasingly to see Malangon as part of the infrastructure that kept quieter rackets running. Law enforcement's approach to organized crime was being reshaped at the same time. In 1985 and 1986, federal prosecutors in Manhattan brought the so-called commission case, using the RICO statute to charge leading figures of New York's 5 families with running a shared governing body for the Mafia. Among the defendants was Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno Long, identified by investigators as a powerful Genovese boss. The evidence in that trial painted a detailed picture of how the family's coordinated strategy and divided control over businesses ranging from gambling to construction. When Salerno and his co-defendants were convicted, it signaled that prosecutors were now willing and able to go after the top layers of the underworld. For the Genovese family, the consequences were significant but not fatal. Power shifted, with Vincent Chin, Gigant emerging as the dominant leader behind a carefully constructed facade of mental instability. Under this new arrangement, the family doubled down on rackets that were less likely to bring immediate public outrage: control of labor unions, infiltration of service industries, and influence over markets. The lesson drawn from the commission trial was not to abandon these operations, but to ensure that those who oversaw them stayed out of the limelight. In that strategy, men like Malangon, firmly connected, comfortable among business owners, and relatively unknown to the general public, were essential. Nowhere was this pattern clearer than at the Fulton fish market on Manhattan's East River. For more than a century, the market had been the central clearinghouse for seafood in New York, a maze of stalls and loading docks where trucks arrived in the darkness before dawn and left again with cargo destined for restaurants and retailers across the region. By the late 20th century, numerous investigative reports had described how the Genovese family exerted control there. Dealers and truckers paid extra fees for basic necessities, access to prime unloading space, the use of loading crews, security. Those who resisted risked finding their deliveries delayed, their parking spaces blocked, or their goods damaged. The mechanics were subtle enough that, on any given day, an outsider walking through the market might not notice anything clearly illegal. The prices posted on chalkboards reflected supply and demand. The men directing traffic and organizing unloading looked like any other supervisors trying to keep a busy operation moving. Yet beneath this surface, investigators found there existed an unwritten code of who controlled which docks, which companies were protected, and which individuals settled disputes. The Genovese family, they concluded, stood at the center of this ecosystem, taking a share of profits while leaving the day-to-day tasks largely in the hands of merchants and truckers. In the 1980s, Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthal's office and the New York State Organized Crime Task Force began to focus closely on the Fulton fish market. They used undercover officers, informants, and financial analysis to map the network of payments and favors that kept the system running. Court documents and press accounts from the period repeatedly mention Genovese connected intermediaries who acted as the link between market businesses and higher-ranking mob figures. Among the names that appeared in this context was Alphonse Malangone. Investigators identified him as one of the figures who helped ensure that the Genovese family's interests were protected at the market, coordinating with truckers and wholesalers, and overseeing certain aspects of its trucking operations. The pattern at Fulton was not unique. Similar dynamics played out at other wholesale food markets and in the distribution chains that brought meat and produce into the city. In each case, the mechanics were slightly different, adjusted to local conditions, but the underlying strategy was consistent. Occupy the choke points where time pressures and logistical complexity made businesses vulnerable, then use that leverage to extract ongoing payments. Control over labor, who got jobs as loaders or drivers, who belonged to which union local, was a crucial part of this system. If a wholesaler needed workers at short notice, or a trucking company wanted to be sure its deliveries would be handled promptly, it was understood that certain people had to be kept satisfied. For Malangon, this meant juggling a series of overlapping roles. He had to be someone market insiders felt they could approach with problems, a promise that a truck would be unloaded on time, that a dispute over a parking space would not escalate. At the same time, he had to ensure that money flowed upward to those in the Genovese hierarchy who expected a share. That dual responsibility demanded a degree of organizational skill and an ability to navigate disputes without drawing outside attention. Violence was rarely used openly in these settings, not because the threat was absent, but because the system worked best when compliance was routine and unquestioned. The same logic applied in the commercial waste industry, where Malangon's influence was even more pronounced. By the early 1980s, New York's private carting system had evolved into a tightly controlled cartel. The official face of the trade was the Association of Trade Waste Removers of Greater New York and similar organizations in the boroughs, a cluster of trade groups that, in principle, existed to represent the interests of hauling companies. In practice, according to later indictments and investigative reporting, these associations functioned as enforcement arms for a system of long-term customer ownership. Once a hauler signed a business to a service contract, that customer was effectively locked in. Other haulers were not supposed to solicit its business, and if a company tried to switch providers, it could quickly learn that such freedom had limits. Here, too, Malangon emerged in law enforcement accounts as an important figure. Investigative reports described him as a Genovese representative in the carting trade, someone who sat in on association meetings, weighed in on disputes over customer accounts, and represented the family's interests when dealing with other crime groups that had a stake in the industry. If two haulers argued over a lucrative route, a string of restaurants in Manhattan, say, or a large office building in Brooklyn, The dispute might ultimately be brought to a small gathering in a back room where someone like Malangon would listen, consult his understanding of the rules, and announce a settlement. The result was a system that offered a degree of stability to participating carding firms. They did not have to fear aggressive competition for their existing customers, but at a significant cost to everyone else. Businesses large and small paid for trash services at rates kept artificially high, with little real chance to shop around. Prospective new haulers who did not wish to participate in the cartel faced powerful disincentives. Trucks could be vandalized, employees intimidated, routes mysteriously delayed or blocked, even when such incidents never rose to the level of reported crimes. The pattern sent a clear message. The industry was closed to outsiders unless they accepted the existing structure. For many years, this arrangement persisted with relatively little public scrutiny. Customers grumbled about prices, and honest haulers complained privately about unfair practices, but few saw a realistic path to change. Inside law enforcement circles, however, awareness was growing. Analysts compared billing rates across cities and noticed that New York's commercial trash costs were consistently higher than those in comparable markets. Investigators followed paper trails linking carding executives to known organized crime figures. Yet these pieces of information remained scattered. To turn them into a prosecutable case required a way to see the cartel from the inside. In the late 1980s, that opportunity began to take shape. The New York Police Department's Organized Crime Investigation Division and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office developed an ambitious plan. Create a new carding company, seemingly ordinary, but in reality controlled by law enforcement, and use it to infiltrate the industry's inner circles. The officer chosen for this undercover assignment, Detective Rick Cowan, would later describe it as entering a parallel city, hidden behind the routine movement of trucks and garbage. Operating under an assumed identity, backed by carefully prepared business records and equipment, he started the slow process of picking up customers and attracting the attention of association representatives. The strategy depended on a key vulnerability in the cartel structure. Because the trade associations existed, superficially, as legitimate entities, they had to deal with any newcomer that began to acquire a noticeable number of customers. The associations were how the cartel enforced its property rights over accounts. Once the undercover company reached a certain threshold of business, its owner, Cowan's alter ego, could expect a visit. That visit came in the form investigators had predicted. A polite but unmistakably firm conversation explaining how the industry worked, who controlled which territories, and what was expected of anyone who wanted to continue operating. Over months and then years, Cowan cultivated relationships with the men who enforced those expectations. He attended meetings, accepted invitations to social gatherings, listened as haulers complained about one another, and sought guidance from higher-level figures. Hidden recording devices captured not only explicit threats but also the casual language of an entrenched system. References to properties, losing heads, slang for losing customers, and straightening out beefs. The goal was not merely to gather evidence of individual extortion attempts, but to document a pattern of conduct that would support RICO charges against those described by prosecutors as the cartel's organizers and overseers. Alphonse Malangone appeared in this undercover narrative as one of the key names that surfaced when disputes needed to be resolved. Carding executives and lower-ranking toughs alike spoke of him as a man whose word carried weight in matters touching Genovese's interests. According to accounts later made public in court, and in Cowan's memoir, associates described taking problems to alley when they involved contested routes or the behavior of haulers thought to be stepping out of line. For investigators, this was significant confirmation of what earlier intelligence had suggested, that Malangon was not merely a peripheral figure, but someone who occupied a coordinating role in the trade waste cartel. This did not mean that he appeared frequently on undercover recordings himself. Careful, higher-level operators in the Genovese family understood the risks of direct involvement and often preferred to work through intermediaries. But in the coded talk of the men the undercover operation encountered, Malangon's name functioned as a reference point, a reminder of an unseen authority whose approval or disapproval could shape outcomes. The very fact that his presence could be felt, without being physically visible, underlined the depth of his influence. While the undercover company quietly expanded, other investigative strands continued to develop. Financial analysts pored over billing records, comparing what cartel-aligned haulers charged to customers and identifying patterns consistent with price fixing. Prosecutors interviewed business owners who, emboldened by the possibility of change, described being told they could not change providers, or finding that their attempts to do so brought them unwanted attention. Some carding insiders, arrested on other charges, chose to cooperate, offering detailed accounts of association meetings, of cash envelopes passed at restaurants, of conversations in which Malangon and others were invoked as final arbiters. At the Fulton fish market, parallel efforts sought to weaken the Genovese family's grip. City and state authorities implemented new licensing requirements for wholesalers and employees, aiming to bar those with serious criminal records or clear organized crime ties. Civil lawsuits attempted to break up long-standing monopolies and to subject market operations to greater transparency. These efforts met with mixed success and sometimes moved slowly, but they formed part of a broader strategy to attack not only individual acts of intimidation, but the structural conditions that had allowed underworld influence to become so entrenched. For men like Malangon, the cumulative effect of this changing environment was not immediately obvious. Day to day, much of the system still functioned as it had for years. Trucks were dispatched, trash collected, fish unloaded. Association meetings went on, yet the ground beneath their feet was shifting. Conversations once held in what seemed like safe company were now, in some cases, being recorded by undercover officers or cooperating witnesses. Paper agreements that had long been treated as routine, contracts with unusually restrictive terms, for instance, were being re-examined by lawyers searching for evidence of illegal restraint of trade. The wider culture, too, had begun to pay more attention to the economic impact of organized crime. High-profile trials had shown juries how deeply the Mafia had penetrated construction, garment manufacturing, and waterfront unions. Journalists extended that scrutiny to the city's more mundane services, including trash collection. Stories detailed how commercial hauling bills in New York exceeded those in other metropolitan areas, and how efforts by independent haulers to compete often ended abruptly. These accounts did not always name Malangon individually, but they described a world he helped oversee, a world increasingly recognized as a problem demanding a systemic solution. By the early 1990s, years of careful investigation were converging. Undercover recordings had captured the language and structure of the trash cartel. Cooperating witnesses had filled in key gaps about who reported to whom and who gave orders in disputes that crossed company lines. Financial analysis had quantified the extra costs borne by businesses as a result of the closed system. At the Fulton fish market and in related sectors, parallel cases had further illuminated how the Genovese family used similar methods to dominate crucial points in the city's supply chains. Within prosecutors' offices, charts and diagrams began to take shape on conference room walls, connecting names like Alphonse Shades, Malangon to companies, trade associations, and other reputed mob figures. For decades, he had succeeded in remaining little known to the general public, even as he became a familiar subject in law enforcement files. That anonymity was about to end. The investigations that had quietly worked their way through recordings, documents, and witness statements were moving toward a decisive phase, one in which the inner workings of New York's trash cartel and the role of men like Malangon within it would be laid out in indictments, and eventually, in open court. In the early 1990s, the years of patient work by detectives, analysts, and prosecutors finally began to coalesce into something concrete. For almost a decade, the commercial trash cartel had operated as if sealed off from outside scrutiny, its internal disputes settled in quiet conversations, its rules enforced more by routine and reputation than by open confrontation. The Fulton fish market, too, still woke before dawn each day, its crowded piers giving little outward hint of the hidden costs built into each crate of seafood that crossed its loading docks. For Alphonse Malangone, these systems were familiar terrain. What he could not see in full were the investigative files thickening in offices downtown, where his name had come to figure prominently. The turning point in the carding investigation was not a single dramatic event, but a series of developments that, taken together, made the cartel's inner workings visible in a way they had never been before. The undercover carding company that had quietly entered the industry now had a track record. Real trucks, real customers, a history of invoices and association meetings. The detective running the operation had sat in enough backroom discussions to learn not just the vocabulary of properties and heads, but the subtler signals that indicated who carried influence. Time and again, when disputes cut across the interests of multiple companies or touched on the boundaries between territories, the men around him referred to figures higher up the chain. Among those names, Ali Shades came up with telling regularity. For investigators, this was more than gossip. It provided a crucial link between the day-to-day enforcement of cartel rules and the broader criminal structure they believed lay behind it. Coupled with surveillance, phone records, and prior intelligence, those mentions helped situate Malangon as part of the Genovese family's supervisory layer in the industry. He was not the only such figure. Other families, including the Gambino and Lucchi's organizations, also had designated representatives, but his role in areas associated with the Genovese sphere of influence, particularly in parts of Manhattan and the Bronx, drew specific attention. While the undercover case unfolded, another front opened in the effort to break organized crime's grip on key marketplaces. At the Fulton fish market, state and local authorities, building on years of investigative work, brought charges that exposed the mechanisms by which the Genovese family exerted control. Indictments described a pattern of extortion and coercion, wholesalers and truckers paying illegal fees, market jobs handed out based on connections rather than merit, and a climate in which resisting these demands invited retaliation in the form of delayed shipments or blocked access. The legal claims were framed in terms of enterprise corruption and racketeering under state law, reflecting a broader trend toward using statutes that targeted ongoing criminal organizations rather than isolated acts. In those Fulton-related cases, Alphonse Malangone was named by prosecutors as one of the intermediaries who linked day-to-day market operations to the Genovese hierarchy. They alleged that he, along with other defendants, coordinated the family's interests, making sure that the revenues extracted from the market flowed upward, while the system's basic order remained intact. As in the carding investigation, the picture that emerged was not of a man personally threatening merchants or wielding overt violence in the aisles of the market. Instead, it was of someone who, by virtue of reputation and position, could influence who received work, which companies prospered, and how money moved behind the scenes. From a legal standpoint, this distinction mattered. It undercut the notion that only those caught in the act of direct coercion were culpable. Under enterprise corruption and RICO frameworks, prosecutors could argue that individuals like Malangon, who did not always appear at the sharp end of an extortion demand, were nonetheless central to maintaining the criminal structure that made such demands meaningful. Court documents described him as a capo, or captain in the Genovese organization, a mid to high-level figure with authority over specific rackets and the men who worked in them. Defense lawyers challenged this characterization, insisting that their clients were, at most, legitimate businessmen unfairly targeted because of their ethnic background and social acquaintances. But judges increasingly accepted the idea that repeated associations, patterns of communication, and financial ties could be used to infer a leadership role in an ongoing criminal enterprise. As these cases moved forward, the carding investigation reached a critical mass. Grand juries heard recordings from the undercover operation, conversations in which cartel rules were explained to the supposed newcomer, admissions that certain customers could not be approached, remarks identifying particular mob-connected figures as the ultimate arbiters of disputes. Witnesses testified about long-standing practices of customer allocation and about association meetings where haulers were instructed to respect one another's properties. Financial analyses showed that commercial trash bills in New York were generally higher than in comparable cities, with limited variation between companies supposedly competing for business. In 1995, this work culminated in a sweeping indictment that targeted what prosecutors openly labeled the garbage cartel. Announced at a press conference by federal and local officials, including representatives of the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office and the Manhattan District Attorney, the charges named more than 20 defendants. They included carding company executives, trade association leaders, and reputed members and associates of the Genovese, Gambino, and Lucchese crime families. Among those identified in the indictment as a key Genovese figure in the industry was Alphonse Malangone. The charges against him and his co-defendants centered on racketeering, extortion, and restraint of trade. Prosecutors alleged that for decades the defendants had participated in, and profited from, a criminal organization that controlled virtually all aspects of New York City's commercial waste removal business. In language that had been painstakingly built from years of investigation, the indictment described a property rights system enforced through threats and acts of intimidation, backed by the authority of organized crime families. According to the government's theory, haulers who refused to abide by cartel rules faced the risk of damaged trucks, harassed customers, or the kind of persistent pressure that could quietly drive a company out of business. When agents and detectives fanned out early one morning to arrest the indicted men, it marked the first time that many New Yorkers heard the names of individuals who had, for years, played a role in determining how the city's trash moved. Television footage showed handcuffed executives in suits and heavy overcoats led past cameras, flanked by U.S. Marshals. Malangon, older now, stocky and silver-haired, appeared as one more figure in that procession, his trademark tinted glasses still in place. At arraignment, he and most of his co-defendants entered pleas of not guilty, beginning a legal process that would stretch on for months and in some cases, years. The prosecution's theory presented him as more than a passive participant. In court filings and press briefings, officials described him as a ranking Genovese representative who oversaw the family's interests in the carding industry and at certain food markets. They alleged that he attended meetings where cartel policies were discussed, weighed in on disputes involving haulers under Genovese protection, and shared in the proceeds generated by the system's inflated prices. Defense attorneys countered that he was being unfairly cast as a villain based on innuendo and guilt by association. They stressed his lack of a high-profile criminal record relative to some of the more notorious mob figures of the era, and argued that business decisions described as sinister by prosecutors were, in fact, ordinary efforts to maintain stability in a heavily regulated and logistically challenging industry. Legal arguments turned on technical questions: how to define an enterprise under RICO, what constituted extortion versus hard bargaining, whether the existence of trade associations with strict rules about customer poaching automatically implied criminal conspiracy. But beneath those technical disputes was a more basic issue: whether the city's commercial trash system had, for all practical purposes, been run according to rules set by organized crime families. To prove that it had, prosecutors relied heavily on the undercover recordings. Jurors heard industry insiders explain, in everyday language, that customers belonged to particular haulers, that switching required approval, and that certain names, including that of Alphonse Malangone, carried decisive weight in settling conflicts. While the federal case moved forward, the ripple effects spread beyond the courtroom. At City Hall, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, a former U.S. attorney with a long history of prosecuting organized crime, seized on the indictments as an opportunity to reform the industry's regulatory framework. Working with the City Council, his administration advanced legislation to create a new licensing authority for commercial waste haulers. This body, eventually known as the Trade Waste Commission and later the Business Integrity Commission, was empowered to deny or revoke licenses for companies with owners or key employees judged to have serious connections to organized crime. The idea was to use licensing, traditionally a bureaucratic formality, as a tool to remake the industry's structure. Public hearings on the legislation brought forward a range of voices. Small business owners testified about their experiences with the cartel, unsolicited calls warning them against changing haulers, sudden problems with pickups after they inquired about lower prices, and the widespread sense that challenging the system was pointless. Some carting company owners, for their part, insisted that associations had existed primarily to stabilize prices in an industry vulnerable to wild swings in costs. But testimony from cooperating witnesses who had once been inside the cartel, combined with the mounting evidence in the federal case, painted a more coercive picture. For Malangon, this changing landscape meant that even if he and his co-defendants found ways to contest or reduce the criminal charges against them, the underlying structures that had supported their influence were eroding. The new licensing regime threatened to exclude any firm substantially controlled by or paying tribute to organized crime figures. Contracts that had rolled over automatically for decades would now, at least in theory, be subject to open bidding. The possibility that the city's trash system might be reorganized on more competitive lines posed a long-term challenge to the Underworld's traditional role. Meanwhile, the Fulton fish market prosecutions continued to advance. In those proceedings, as at the carting trial, Malangon faced allegations that he had functioned as a conduit for Genovese control, particularly over trucking and unloading operations. Witnesses described how market employees understood that certain men, though not formally employed by the city or any regulatory body, nonetheless exercised real authority over who received which jobs and how disputes were resolved. The picture of his influence that emerged was consistent across the two arenas, different commodities, but similar methods of behind-the-scenes guidance and enforcement. Over time, the weight of evidence in these cases produced a series of plea agreements and convictions. Some co-defendants in the carting case chose to cooperate with authorities, providing additional detail about meetings, profit-sharing arrangements, and the chain of command that connected haulers and association officers to mob representatives. Others went to trial and were convicted on racketeering and related counts. Malangon himself ultimately faced serious legal consequences. In both state and federal proceedings, he accepted plea deals that acknowledged his role in the rackets described by prosecutors. These pleas led to substantial prison sentences, measured in years rather than months, marking the first time that his activities, long known mainly to specialists, had resulted in a sustained loss of liberty. Even in the restrained atmosphere of a courtroom, the social costs of the systems he had helped maintain were a recurring theme. Judges, in explaining sentences, emphasized that the harm done by the carting cartel and the corrupted markets was not abstract. It fell on thousands of ordinary people, business owners who paid more than they should have for basic services, workers whose jobs depended on staying silent about practices they knew were wrong, and honest would-be competitors who never had a fair chance to enter the market. The financial magnitude of that harm, measured in inflated bills and lost opportunities, formed part of the rationale for imposing significant penalties. For those who had investigated him, Malangon's downfall represented both a personal and institutional milestone. On a personal level, detectives and prosecutors who had spent years tracking his movements and listening to recorded mentions of his name could point to a tangible outcome. Institutionally, the cases against him and his peers demonstrated that long-term, evidence-driven strategies could succeed in industries where, for decades, organized crime had been treated as an inevitable cost of doing business. The combined use of undercover operations, RICO statutes, and regulatory reforms created a template that would be applied with variations to other sectors in the years that followed. From the vantage point of the neighborhoods where he had grown up, however, his conviction carried a more complicated resonance. For some, it was a clear-cut case. A man who had chosen a life in the Mafia, using community ties as a springboard for corruption, had finally been held to account. Others, particularly those who had known him in more informal settings, social clubs, family gatherings, community events, saw a less one-dimensional figure. They remembered gestures of generosity or help in times of need, and struggled to reconcile those memories with the cold language of indictments and sentencing memoranda. This tension between personal loyalty and the broader social damage inflicted by organized crime had long been a feature of Italian-American communities touched by the Mafia's presence. Alphonse Malangone entered prison as a man in late middle age, his years of peak influence behind him. The world he left on the outside was not the same one that had enabled his rise. At the Fulton fish market, stepped-up regulation and ongoing enforcement efforts slowly loosened the Genovese family's hold, even as elements of the old culture lingered. In the carding industry, new licensing rules and competitive bidding began to change the lineup of firms collecting the city's trash. Some companies with deep cartel ties folded or were sold. Others attempted to recast themselves under new ownership structures that could pass regulatory scrutiny. Yet the legacy of the system he had helped manage could not be undone overnight. Long-term contracts still needed to expire or be renegotiated. Patterns of expectation among customers, haulers, and workers took time to shift. The story of his legal downfall, in that sense, was not only about the end of one man's career in organized crime, but about a city laboring to disentangle basic economic functions from decades of underworld entanglement. It raised enduring questions about how deeply criminal influence could sink into the fabric of urban life, and what it took, not only in terms of police work, but of political will and regulatory reform, to pull it out. The man who had once walked into social clubs as a quiet authority and later into a courthouse, surrounded by cameras, now passed his days in a regulated environment, far removed from the markets and loading docks that had defined his working life. Outside, investigators and policymakers continued to grapple with the aftermath of the carding and market cases, measuring progress not only in convictions, but in lower bills for small businesses and reduced opportunities for criminal groups to reassert themselves. Inside, Malangon had time to reflect on a career that had begun in the crowded streets of mid-century New York and led, through a series of incremental choices, to a role at the center of systems that were finally being dismantled. The first months after sentencing marked an abrupt reversal of the life Alphonse Malangone had known for decades. For years, his days had revolved around loading docks, association offices, and the quiet back rooms where disputes over routes and contracts were settled. The rhythms were his own, meetings arranged on short notice, phone calls answered when it suited him, arrivals and departures timed to avoid unnecessary attention. Now his schedule was dictated by others. Doors opened and closed at fixed hours, movements were supervised, and the informal authority he had exercised on the outside was confined to the narrow social hierarchies of prison life. Public documentation of his time behind bars is limited, consisting mainly of court records, scattered news references, and the occasional remark by former law enforcement officials recalling the larger arc of the carding and market cases. There are no detailed memoirs by Malangon himself, no interviews in which he reflects at length on his career. What can be established is that he began serving a substantial, multi-year sentence in the mid-1990s, imposed in connection with racketeering and related charges arising from his role in the Fulton fish market and commercial carding rackets. The precise length and conditions of that term are noted in sentencing transcripts and docket entries, but they enter the historical record mainly as markers of time. An aging Genovese capo removed from the active field of operations and placed in an environment where his influence, once carried on phone calls and discreet meetings, was sharply constrained. Court proceedings in the months after sentencing provide a window into how the legal system understood his place in the broader story. In arguments over bail pending appeal and in sentencing memoranda, prosecutors emphasized the seriousness of the conduct attributed to him. Long-running participation in schemes that distorted basic economic relationships in the city harmed countless small businesses and reinforced the power of a criminal organization over ostensibly legitimate industries. Defense attorneys, by contrast, stressed his age, his lack of direct involvement in spectacular violence, and his family ties. They urged the court to see him not as a master criminal, but as a man who had grown up in a particular milieu and found himself entangled in structures that had existed long before he reached adulthood. Judges, while sometimes acknowledging his personal history and age, consistently treated his role as significant. In explaining their sentences, they pointed to the length of time the rackets had operated and the difficulty legitimate businesses faced in freeing themselves from cartel arrangements. They noted that without the guidance of individuals like Malangon, men who connected street-level enforcers, business owners, and higher-ranking mob figures, the systems at the Fulton fish market and in the carding industry could not have sustained themselves for so long. His removal from that ecosystem was therefore justified, in their view, not only as punishment, but as a means of disrupting entrenched patterns of criminal control. Outside the courtroom, the reverberations of the cases in which he was a central figure continued to shape New York's economic landscape. At the Fulton fish market, reforms that had been discussed for years gathered momentum. Authorities tightened licensing requirements, scrutinizing the backgrounds of wholesalers, trucking companies, and key employees. Applicants with clear ties to organized crime, including prior convictions or documented associations, faced denial or revocation of licenses. City inspectors and law enforcement officers maintained a more consistent presence at the market, monitoring not only hygiene and safety, but also the informal allocation of space and work that had long been the Underworld's domain. These steps did not instantly erase the culture of fear and deference that had taken root over decades, but they gradually altered the incentives facing merchants and workers. As regulators signaled a greater willingness to act on reports of coercion, some individuals who might once have kept quiet began to see the possibility of conducting business without paying extra fees, beyond official rent and service charges. The market's eventual relocation in the mid-2000s from its historic site in Lower Manhattan to a modern facility at Hunts Point in the Bronx symbolized, for many observers, the end of an era. The old piers, with their dark corners and layered traditions, were replaced by a more regulated environment where long-standing informal arrangements were harder to maintain. In the commercial waste industry, the impact of the cartel prosecutions and related regulatory changes was even more far-reaching. The newly empowered city licensing body examined the ownership structures of carding companies, their financial histories, and the backgrounds of their principals. Licenses were denied or revoked for firms unable to demonstrate independence from organized crime influence. Some long-established haulers, whose business models had been inseparable from the cartel's customer allocation system, chose to sell their assets or dissolve rather than attempt to operate under the new rules. Others restructured, bringing in new partners or managers in an effort to convince regulators that they no longer posed a risk. For customers, restaurants, office buildings, small manufacturers, the changes gradually appeared in the form of revised contracts and, in many cases, lower rates. Investigations by journalists and public interest groups in the late 1990s and early 2000s documented declines in average commercial trash bills as more competitive bidding took hold. The shift was not uniform. Some businesses saw little immediate difference, and the industry remained complex. But the overall trend supported the argument prosecutors had made, that the cartel, in which Malangon had played a notable role, had effectively imposed a hidden surcharge on the city's commercial life. From his vantage point within the prison system, the dismantling of the structures he had helped to manage unfolded at a distance. Inmates do receive news through television, newspapers, and visits, and it is reasonable to assume that Malangon became aware, over time, of the regulatory reforms and further cases affecting the Genovese and other families. But there is no public record of him speaking at length about these developments. Unlike some former underworld figures who later cooperated with authorities and gave interviews reflecting on their past, he left behind no extensive public testimony that would reveal his reactions as the world he knew changed. This silence is itself revealing. It underscores the way in which he had always operated, quietly, without the flamboyance that drew cameras toward other mob figures in their prime. Even when his name became attached to high-profile prosecutions, he did not seek to cultivate a public persona. After his convictions, that reserve persisted. To the extent that he appears in later narratives, such as investigative books about the trash cartel and the Fulton fish market, it is in the voices of others. Detectives recalling surveillance operations, prosecutors reconstructing meetings from witness statements, or co-defendants describing his role in the internal hierarchy of the Genovese family. Within law enforcement circles, his case helped to solidify certain lessons. One was the effectiveness of long-term, undercover infiltration of industries shaped by subtle coercion rather than daily overt violence. The success of the carding investigation demonstrated that it was possible to document from the inside the day-to-day workings of a criminally influenced trade group. Instead of relying solely on the testimony of co-conspirators who turned state's evidence, always vulnerable to credibility challenges, prosecutors could present juries with recordings and documents that showed how insiders themselves explained the rules. The repeated references to figures like Ali on those tapes became powerful evidence, not because they revealed dramatic confessions, but because they revealed a routine assumption that everyone in the business recognized certain people as ultimate authorities. Another lesson concerned the value of coupling criminal prosecutions with administrative reforms. Without the parallel creation of a licensing body willing to exclude companies with organized crime ties, the removal of individuals like Malangon could have been only a temporary disruption. Younger or lesser-known associates might have stepped into the vacuum, preserving the cartel's basic structure. By changing the regulatory environment at the same time, city officials made it harder for the old systems to reconstitute themselves under different names. In this sense, the cases involving him contributed not only to individual accountability, but to a broader rethinking of how to keep key urban services insulated from criminal capture. Inside academic and policy discussions, his story began to be cited as a case study in enterprise crime, the use of ostensibly legitimate businesses and trade groups as vehicles for sustained illegal activity. Criminologists analyzing the evolution of organized crime in the late 20th century contrasted figures like Malangon with earlier generations of more overtly violent gang leaders. They noted that while violence remained a tool of enforcement, the central skill set in many profitable rackets had shifted toward managerial and relational capacities. Understanding regulatory loopholes, cultivating influence within unions and trade associations, and balancing the often competing demands of different criminal and business interests. In this framework, his influence at the Fulton fish market and in the carting industry exemplified a mature stage in the development of American Mafia enterprises. At the same time, Italian-American civic organizations and writers continued to grapple with the stigma attached to communities so often associated, in popular imagination, with mob figures like him. Many emphasized that the vast majority of Italian Americans in New York had no connection to organized crime, and in fact, had been among its victims, paying inflated prices, facing barriers to honest competition, and living under the same cloud of fear and silence that allowed mafiosi to operate. In this narrative, men like Alphonse Malangone were not representative leaders of their ethnic community, but rather members of a small criminal subculture that exploited the trust and cohesion of that community for private gain. As the years of his sentence passed, the Genovese family itself underwent further changes. Federal and state prosecutions continued to chip away at its leadership, targeting not only high-profile bosses and capos, but also the mid-level operatives who kept its rackets functioning. Some rackets proved more resilient than others. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, and certain forms of labor racketeering remained recurring themes in indictments. But the kind of near-total control that the family had once exerted over specific markets and industries became harder to maintain under the combined pressure of law enforcement, changing economic conditions, and shifts in public tolerance for corruption. It is not clear from the public record exactly how Malangon spent his time in prison, whether he worked in institutional jobs, pursued educational programs, or largely kept to himself. Accounts from former law enforcement officials who encountered him during periodic legal proceedings suggest that he maintained the same reserved demeanor he had shown throughout his career, rarely offering more than necessary in conversation. Appeals and post-conviction motions, where they occurred, focused on legal issues rather than sweeping claims of innocence. There is no indication that he became a cooperating witness against his former associates. His plea agreements, so far as the record shows, were structured around acknowledging sufficient facts to support his convictions and sentences rather than exchanging information for leniency. Eventually, as with most prison terms, his sentence moved toward its conclusion. Depending on the exact combination of state and federal time, credit for good behavior, and any adjustments ordered by the courts, his scheduled release date would have fallen in the early years of the new century. When he did leave custody, whether on parole or supervised release, it was into a city markedly different from the one he had helped to shape from the shadows. Manhattan's skyline had been transformed by new waves of development. The Fulton fish market had left its historic home. The commercial carting industry operated under a licensing regime that would have been unrecognizable to those who had built the old cartel. The Genovese family, while still regarded by law enforcement as a significant criminal organization, no longer possessed the same undisputed sway over the trades that had once been its principal revenue streams. What is striking about this later phase of his life is how little attention it attracted. Having once been the subject of front-page stories about the garbage cartel and organized crime at the fish market, he faded from public view. Unlike some aging mob figures who reappeared in the news because of parole violations, new indictments, or high-profile deaths, Malangon largely disappeared from headline coverage. Occasional references surfaced when journalists revisited the history of the trash cartel or the Fulton fish market. But these were retrospective, looking back on his role in those older cases rather than reporting new developments. For historians and analysts, this relative silence poses a challenge. It limits the ability to trace in detail how his perspectives may have changed over time, whether he regretted his involvement, maintained loyalty to old associates, or viewed himself as a casualty of changing times. Absent first-hand accounts, any attempt to reconstruct his inner life would be speculative and therefore unreliable. What can be said, with some confidence, is that his public trajectory follows a pattern seen in many organized crime careers of his generation. A rise rooted in mid-century neighborhood networks and the exploitation of under-regulated industries, followed by a fall precipitated by the maturation of legal tools designed to target precisely such long-running enterprises. It is in that pattern, rather than in personal confession or dramatic transformation, that his historical significance lies. The cases that brought him down, built on undercover infiltration, wiretaps, and complex financial analysis, marked a turning point in how cities like New York confronted the embedded power of the Mafia. They shifted the focus from reactive responses to individual crimes toward proactive efforts to dismantle criminal infrastructures in sectors as seemingly mundane as trash collection and wholesale food distribution. In doing so, they helped to redefine public understanding of organized crime itself, from a world of smoky back rooms and secret blood oaths to one in which control over trade associations and service contracts could be as consequential as any high-stakes robbery. By the time Alphonse Malangone had completed his sentence and receded from public notice, that redefinition was well underway. Law enforcement training programs taught new generations of investigators about the carding case and the Fulton fish market as exemplars of successful enterprise investigations. Regulatory bodies in other cities looked to New York's experience when designing their own safeguards against criminal infiltration of key industries. And in the neighborhoods where he had once moved with quiet authority, younger residents grew up in an environment where the old social clubs had either closed or lost much of their significance, and where the assumption that certain men ran particular trades no longer held in the same way. His personal story, shaped by the post-war streets of New York and the evolution of the American Mafia, thus became part of a larger narrative about institutional learning and change. Even in the absence of detailed accounts of his final years, the arc from influence to incarceration to obscurity offers a lens through which to view the broader decline of traditional Cosa Nostra power over the city's everyday economic life. In the years after Alphonse Malangone walked out of prison, the New York he re-entered was no longer the city that had made his career possible. The old piers of Lower Manhattan had been largely redeveloped. The Fulton fish market, once a warren of sheds and cobblestones along the East River, was on its way to a modern refrigerated complex at Hunts Point. The commercial carding trade that he had helped dominate through quiet, coercive rules operated under a licensing system that treated any whiff of organized crime influence as grounds for exclusion. And the Genovese family itself, while still recognized by investigators as one of the most powerful mafia organizations in the United States, faced a legal and economic environment far less hospitable to the kind of entrenched control he had once exercised. The public record is sparse on the details of his life after release. There are no widely available interviews, no memoir, no detailed reportage tracing his movements in the 2000s and beyond. Unlike some former mob figures who sought publicity as authors, speakers, or cautionary examples, Malangon did not reappear in front of cameras. For historians, this silence means that the final chapter of his personal story must be approached with caution. We know that he served a substantial sentence for racketeering and related offenses, that he completed it, and that he returned to civilian life in an era when both the Mafia and the industries it had once dominated were under unprecedented scrutiny. Beyond that, the record turns outward, to the legacy of the systems he helped build, and the ways in which his name continued to surface in discussions of organized crime and urban governance. One of the most visible arenas where that legacy played out was in the ongoing work of New York City's trade waste regulator. The body first created in the mid-1990s in direct response to the garbage cartel cases. Initially known as the Trade Waste Commission and later reconstituted as the Business Integrity Commission, this agency was given a mandate that would have seemed extraordinary in the era of Malangon's rise, to look not only at a company's financial soundness and safety record, but also at the personal histories and associations of its key personnel. A carting firm seeking a license could be asked to disclose connections to individuals named in organized crime investigations, including men like Alphonse Malangone. If regulators found those connections too close for comfort, the company could be barred from operating in the city. Over the following decade, that approach reshaped the commercial waste industry. Large, often nationally based companies with more formal corporate structures entered the market, competing with a reduced number of local haulers that had successfully distanced themselves from the old cartel system. Some former cartel-linked firms, or their successors, struggled to shed their histories. In public hearings, regulators occasionally cited past relationships with figures such as Malangon as indicators that a company might still be vulnerable to underworld influence. Even when those references were brief, they underscored the enduring weight of his name as shorthand for a discredited way of doing business. At the Fulton fish market, reforms followed a similar trajectory, though the pace and results were shaped by the market's unique history and the logistical challenges of moving an entire wholesale complex. Investigations and prosecutions in the 1990s had exposed the mechanisms by which the Genovese family, with the help of intermediaries like Malangon, had exerted control. The response combined law enforcement and regulatory changes, stricter licensing, a greater presence of inspectors, and an insistence that decisions about jobs and space be based on transparent criteria rather than deference to informal market bosses. When the market finally relocated to Hunts Point in 2005, city officials explicitly framed the move as a break with the past. The new facility's design, with its controlled access points, centralized management, and improved record keeping, was intended in part to make it harder for any covert hierarchy to re-establish itself. In press coverage of the move, reporters often revisited the earlier era, recounting how Genovese's influence had once shaped which trucks unloaded where and at what cost. In those retrospective pieces, Malangon's name appeared as one of the key figures from that period, a man whose behind-the-scenes authority had helped define daily routines in a place that few ordinary New Yorkers ever saw. The most detailed public account of his role in the carting and market rackets, however, did not come from official reports, but from within law enforcement itself. In 2002, the detective who had gone undercover in the trash industry, Rick Cowan, published a book with journalist Douglas Century, recounting the years he had spent posing as the owner of a small carting company. The book described, in accessible narrative form, how the undercover firm had been drawn into the orbit of the trade waste associations, how properties and heads were allocated, and how disputes were referred upward to mob-connected figures. While the focus was on the operation as a whole rather than any one person, the text and the contemporaneous publicity around it highlighted the role of Genovese emissaries such as Ali Shades in maintaining the cartel's discipline. For readers outside New York, many of whom had never given serious thought to how a city's trash was collected, this account was an education in the economics of everyday extortion. It showed how a man like Malangon could gain substantial influence not by spectacular acts, but by positioning himself at the junction of trade associations, small businesses, and criminal networks. In that sense, the book and other journalistic treatments that followed helped cement his significance as a representative figure of a particular phase in organized crime history. Less the archetypal neighborhood enforcer than the manager of a quiet but lucrative criminal enterprise embedded in the ordinary functioning of urban life. Academic studies of organized crime in the late 20th century also began to use his case as a reference point. Scholars examining the evolution of the American Mafia noted a shift, beginning in the post-war period and intensifying by the 1970s and 1980s, from reliance on traditional vice markets, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and so on, toward deeper involvement in regulated industries. In this framework, the Fulton fish market and the commercial carting industry were not anomalies but logical targets. Both involved essential services, both featured time pressures and logistical complexities that magnified the power of anyone who could disrupt them, and both relied on trade groups or unions that could serve as conduits for outside influence. Within those sectors, researchers argued, figures like Alphonse Malangone played a crucial bridging role. They had enough standing within the Mafia to speak with authority on behalf of a family, but also enough familiarity with legitimate business practices and regulatory environments to make decisions that kept operations profitable, and for long stretches, below the threshold of aggressive legal scrutiny. When criminologists and legal scholars wrote about enterprise corruption and infiltrated legitimate businesses, his name appeared among the examples used to illustrate how such infiltrations worked in practice. At the same time, a parallel conversation continued within Italian-American communities and advocacy organizations about how to address the persistent association between their heritage and the Mafia. Books and documentaries that revisited the trash cartel and the Fulton fish market often foregrounded the Italian-American identity of men like Malangon, sometimes reinforcing stereotypes that community leaders had long sought to dispel. In response, writers and activists emphasized that while certain mid-century immigrant networks had provided a context in which organized crime could flourish, those networks had been overwhelmingly populated by law-abiding people. They pointed out that the economic harm inflicted by the rackets in which Malangon participated had fallen heavily on Italian-American small business owners and workers, who paid inflated rates and faced intimidation when they tried to resist. Some historians approach the question by situating Malangon and his peers in a broader narrative of immigrant adaptation and structural inequality. They traced how early generations of Italian Americans were often excluded from elite professions and faced discrimination in housing and employment. In that environment, for a small minority, the nexus of unions, small contracting firms, and criminal organizations offered a parallel path to material security and influence. Scholars were careful not to portray this as an inevitability. Many people with similar backgrounds chose other routes, but they argued that understanding figures like alley shades required grappling with those structural factors as well as individual choices. For law enforcement agencies, the memory of his career served as both a warning and a guide. It demonstrated how deeply a criminal group could embed itself in apparently routine sectors of the economy, and how difficult it could be to uproot that influence once it was established. Training programs for investigators in organized crime and corruption units used the Carting and Fulton cases to emphasize the importance of looking beyond conventional street crime indicators. Instead of waiting for explicit complaints about threats or violence, they urged trainees to examine patterns of pricing, contract terms, and ownership structures, areas in which someone like Malangon had operated with relative safety for years. Those same cases also highlighted the potential limits of traditional policing when confronting systemic corruption. Without tools like RICO, enterprise corruption statutes, and specialized regulatory bodies, investigators might have been able to arrest individual enforcers or disrupt particular incidents of intimidation. But the underlying arrangement, the understanding that certain industries were controlled by particular families, would likely have persisted. The fact that cases involving Malangon and his associates resulted not only in prison sentences, but in lasting changes to city regulations gave many in law enforcement a sense that this time, something more fundamental had shifted. Even as his story became embedded in these institutional narratives, the world of organized crime continued to change. By the 2010s, law enforcement officials and researchers observed that traditional mafia families, including the Genoese, faced competition from other forms of organized crime, international drug cartels, cyber crime rings, and transnational fraud schemes, among others. The old model of neighborhood-based, ethnically defined organizations with stable control over local industries seemed less central to the criminal landscape than it had been in Malangon's prime. When new cases did surface involving the Genoese or other families, they often featured smaller-scale rackets, attempts to reassert influence over particular unions, or involvement in more fluid ventures like illegal sports betting, operations that, while serious, did not match the structural dominance once exercised over the city's trash collection or wholesale food distribution. In that context, his career began to appear, in retrospect, as part of a high watermark in mafia involvement in the legitimate economy. The arc, from gradual infiltration of underregulated trades through decades of quiet control to eventual dismantling by coordinated legal and regulatory action, offered a template for understanding how similar patterns might play out in other places and times. Internationally, officials in cities as far away as Naples, Palermo, and Hong Kong studied the New York experience, including the cases centered on Ali Shades and his peers, to inform their efforts against local forms of organized crime infiltration in waste management, ports, and markets. Meanwhile, in New York itself, the physical and social landscapes that had nurtured his rise continued to evolve. The Italian-American enclaves of his childhood and youth, once dense with social clubs, small family-run shops, and informal networks of mutual aid, had diversified. Many long-time residents had moved to the suburbs or other parts of the country, replaced by new waves of immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe. The spaces where mid-century mob figures had gathered, from smoky clubrooms to certain back tables in local restaurants, were fewer and more exposed to a world where nearly everyone carried a camera in their pocket, and where surveillance was far more readily available, both public and private. In documentary films and television series produced in the late 2000s and 2010s, segments dealing with the trash cartel or the Fulton fish market often used archived footage of the 1990s arrests and courthouse appearances to illustrate the era. Viewers saw a middle-aged Malangon, emerging from proceedings in a dark overcoat, his eyes hidden behind the sunglasses that had given him his nickname. Voice-over narration placed him among a set of figures whose working lives had been spent making sure that the outwardly mundane tasks of hauling garbage and unloading fish followed rules set not by open competition, but by a clandestine hierarchy. These portrayals, while sometimes dramatized for effect, generally avoided the overt romanticization that had characterized earlier depictions of the Mafia. By focusing on the prosaic details of how cartel billing worked, or how market jobs were allocated, they emphasized the small but constant impositions that defined life under such systems. In that framing, Ali Shades appeared less as a glamorous outlaw and more as a man who had devoted his considerable organizational talents to maintaining structures that left many ordinary people with little real choice. By the time these documentaries aired, Malangon himself had receded fully into private life. Publicly accessible records do not provide a detailed timeline of his final years or the circumstances of his death. Obituaries, where they exist, circulated mainly within family and community circles rather than in the broader media. In historical terms, this quiet exit stands in contrast to the conspicuous way in which his name once appeared on indictments and in press conferences announcing the end of the garbage cartel or the clean-up of the fish market. But it is consistent with the pattern of his earlier career, in which his influence was felt most strongly in spaces that were, for a long time, largely invisible to the general public. For the purposes of understanding the era he helped to shape, the absence of a dramatic public ending may be less important than the structures that remained after he was gone. The industries in which he had been most active continued to operate, serving the same basic functions in the life of the city. Trash was still collected, fish was still delivered and sold. Yet the frameworks governing those activities, the licensing regimes, transparency requirements, and law enforcement oversight, had been altered in ways that made it more difficult for any single criminal organization to reproduce the kind of systemic control the Genovese family once enjoyed. In that sense, the enduring significance of Alphonse Malangone lies not only in the details of his biography, but in the institutional shifts his career helped to provoke. His long involvement in New York's carding industry and wholesale markets illustrated, for investigators and the broader public, the extent to which organized crime could burrow into the most routine aspects of urban life. The prosecutions that brought him down demonstrated that such influence was not inevitable, that with sufficient political will, legal innovation, and patient investigative work, even deeply rooted criminal systems could be dismantled. As later generations looked back on the period when men like him quietly structured who hauled the city's garbage and who unloaded its fish, they saw a cautionary tale, a reminder that corruption, when left unchecked, can become woven into the everyday transactions that sustain a metropolis. They also saw an example of how societies can respond, not only by punishing individuals, but by changing the rules of the game so that similar careers become harder to pursue. Positioned at the intersection of those two narratives, Alphonse Malangone remains a key figure for anyone seeking to understand how the American Mafia moved from the fringes of the city to the center of its economic infrastructure, and how, over time, that grip was forced to loosen. Long after the last of the major trials had ended, after the Fulton fish market had moved uptown and the garbage cartel had been formally dismantled, Alphonse Malangone's name lived on in places the public rarely saw. In windowless classrooms at police academies and at conferences for prosecutors and regulators, his story was recounted as a case study. On projection screens, investigators put up flow charts and grainy surveillance photos showing the web of companies, trade associations, and social connections that had once linked the Fulton docks and the city's dumpsters to the Genovese crime family. Somewhere on those diagrams, near the center of the cluster labeled carding, or Fulton fish, appeared the name of a man who, for decades, had been almost entirely unknown outside a narrow circle of law enforcement, racketeers, and business owners. To the young detectives and lawyers in those rooms, learning about him at a distance of years, Malangon's life offered a way to understand not only what organized crime had done in New York, but how it had done it. His career traced a line from the crowded Italian-American neighborhoods of mid-century New York through the long arc of Mafia expansion into legitimate-looking businesses, and then into the era of enterprise-level prosecutions. Unlike the notorious bosses whose faces had appeared on front pages, men like John Gotti or Vincent Gigant, he had built his influence not by courting celebrity, but by mastering the unglamorous mechanics of trade associations, labor arrangements, and municipal contracts. That difference mattered. It challenged the sensational image of the Mafia as a world of nightclubs and shootouts, reminding anyone who looked closely that the organization's most durable gains had often come from controlling essential but dull-seeming services. It also underscored a theme that investigators now emphasize to each new generation, that organized crime's greatest successes often came when it was able to embed itself so thoroughly in the ordinary functioning of a city that its presence ceased to be recognized as abnormal. Seen from this vantage point, the path that led Malangone from the streets of his youth to the role of Genovese captain overseeing carding and market rackets was not a string of isolated choices, but an almost textbook example of how certain social and economic conditions could draw a subset of individuals into organized crime. The Italian-American neighborhoods where he came of age were full of people trying to move upward through small business, construction, and unionized labor, sectors where proximity to the mafia could be both a threat and, for some, an opportunity. Formal avenues into the professional middle class were narrower than they would be for later generations. Discrimination and limited access to elite education shaped the options available to many working-class youths. Within that context, the local mob's mixture of intimidation and assistance, extra cash for a struggling business, help resolving a dispute, pressure applied in the right place at City Hall, could seem less like distant criminality and more like a familiar, if troubling, part of community life. For most, this did not lead to active involvement in racketeering. But for those with certain talents, an ability to read people, to handle money, to navigate both street culture and more formal settings, the line between legitimate hustle and criminal enterprise could blur. Over time, as the mafia shifted its focus from street-level vice to deeper infiltration of unions and industries, it was precisely these hybrid skills that became most valuable. By the 1960s and 1970s, when Malangon was solidifying his role within the Genovese family's economic operations, New York provided fertile ground for this kind of figure. The city was sprawling and complex, with vast flows of goods and waste moving through spaces that were simultaneously heavily regulated and poorly supervised. The waterfront, the wholesale markets, the construction trades, and the commercial sanitation sector all relied on layers of subcontracting and informal understandings that could be difficult for any single public agency to monitor. Unions, vital for worker protection, also created choke points that could be exploited if corrupt leaders were willing to trade labor peace or job access for under-the-table payments. In that environment, men like Ali Shades found their niche. Their value to the mafia lay less in their capacity for direct violence than in their ability to make complex systems work to the family's benefit. They knew which city inspectors could cause trouble and which could be mollified, which union officers could deliver a promise of no strikes, which business owners were likely to fall in line with cartel rules if pushed, and which might need firmer reminders. They understood that the most profitable rackets were often those that made themselves look like normal business practice. The Fulton fish market offered a particularly vivid illustration. For generations, it had operated according to its own internal traditions. Stalls inherited through families, unwritten rules about unloading and parking, an acceptance that certain market characters held sway over hearing and conflict resolution. By the time prosecutors in the 1980s and 1990s pried open its inner workings, those traditions had been woven together with the Genovese family's interests. Malangon's alleged role there, as an intermediary between the street-level operations and the upper echelons of the family, showed how deeply the mafia had embedded itself in an institution that many outsiders regarded almost romantically as a picturesque remnant of old New York. The commercial carding cartel worked on similar principles, though its reach was even broader. For decades, the system that he helped oversee as a Genovese representative turned a competitive urban service industry into a closed shop. Its genius, from the mafia's perspective, lay in how ordinary it appeared. Contracts were printed on standard forms. Trucks bore company logos, not gang insignia. When a restaurant owner or office manager signed a long-term agreement with a hauler, they rarely saw anyone who identified themselves as part of a criminal organization. The pressure to stay with that hauler, whether in the form of discouraging visits, unexplained problems with pickups, or simply ominous advice from other business owners, floated just beyond the frame of official paperwork. For years, this arrangement survived precisely because it did not conform to familiar images of criminality. It was not a protection racket in the classic sense of someone offering to keep your windows from getting broken for a weekly fee, nor an obviously rigged gambling operation. It functioned within the legal architecture of contracts, invoices, and trade groups. That subtlety shielded people like Malangon from scrutiny, at least for a time. It also made the eventual legal response more complicated. Law enforcement had to prove not just that some intimidation occurred, but that the entire structure of the industry had been distorted by a coordinated criminal enterprise. The investigative push that finally brought him down revealed, for the first time in a systematic way, how these structures looked from the inside. The undercover tapes captured haulers debating who owned which customer, association leaders reminding members of the rules, and references to Ali as someone who would have the final say in certain conflicts. When those recordings were played in court, they did more than incriminate specific individuals. They made audible the everyday language of a closed system. Jurors could hear for themselves how normalized the cartel's assumptions had become, and how integral figures like Malangon were to maintaining that normalization. The legal tools used against him, most notably the RICO statute and state-level enterprise corruption laws, reflected a shift in how American law thought about organized crime. Earlier eras had focused on prosecuting discrete offenses, a bribery here, an assault there. By the time of the Carding and Fulton cases, prosecutors were arguing that the true harm lay in the continuity and coordination of criminal activity over time. Ali's shades appeared in their indictments not as a one-time offender, but as a person whose career embodied that continuity. His presence at multiple key points, trash markets, unions, made him a convenient focal point for explaining to judges and juries what an enterprise looked like when it operated largely through legitimate business forms. Yet even as the law treated him as a central figure in the criminal landscape, reactions within the communities he came from were more ambivalent. As with many mafia figures, some neighbors and acquaintances remembered him as a man who could be generous on a personal level, who donated to local causes, attended family gatherings, and in some cases, quietly helped people in trouble. That duality, harmful on a systemic level, yet sometimes helpful on an individual one, has long complicated public understanding of organized crime. It helps explain why, for years, many people in affected neighborhoods were reluctant to cooperate with authorities. The same network that inflated their bills or narrowed their job options also provided a safety net in a society where other institutions often felt distant or unresponsive. Historians and sociologists who later examined his career tried to keep both sides of that reality in view. They noted that while figures like Malangon exploited their communities, they also emerged from them, shaped by experiences of marginalization as well as by ambition and personal choice. The Italian-American world of his youth was one where success often depended on informal connections, where the boundary between favor trading and corruption was not always clear. Over time, as discrimination receded and newer generations gained wider access to education and mainstream professions, the social soil that had nurtured his generation of mob figures began to change. Young Italian Americans in the 1990s and 2000s increasingly saw the mafia not as a potential path to influence, but as an embarrassment, a stereotype imposed from outside. This cultural shift intersected with the institutional changes that followed his prosecution. The very idea that a city would create a commission for business integrity in industries like trash collection and wholesale food would have struck earlier generations as fanciful. By the early 21st century, such oversight was accepted as a necessary guardrail, and not only in New York. Other cities, confronted with their own histories of mobbed-up construction trades or corrupt port operations, looked to the measures devised in response to the garbage cartel and the Fulton fish market when designing reforms. In official reports and policy papers, Malangon's name appeared among those of other defendants, not as a singular villain, but as one node in a broader pattern that regulators were determined not to let recur. At the same time, his story fed into a reevaluation of the popular culture surrounding the mafia. For decades, Films and novels had alternated between demonizing and glamorizing organized crime figures, often emphasizing dramatic violence and family loyalty at the expense of the more mundane realities of extortion and market manipulation. The details that emerged from the Carding and Fulton investigations, rate sheets, meeting minutes, snippets of conversation about properties and dues, compelled storytellers to confront a less cinematic but more socially significant side of the underworld. Documentaries began to treat the trash cartel and the fish market not as colorful backdrops, but as subjects in their own right. When they mentioned Ali Shades, it was often in the context of explaining how his choices had contributed to a system that quietly extracted wealth from tens of thousands of ordinary transactions. Dramatic reenactments gave way to diagrams of ownership structures and interviews with small business owners who described feeling trapped by contracts they had never realized were part of a larger criminal scheme. This shift in storytelling helped demystify the Mafia, presenting it not as an abstract force of fate or honor, but as a set of very human decisions, made day after day, about how to use power. For the Genovese family, his fall and the dismantling of the rackets he had helped run represented both a loss and a warning. The family survived, as it had survived many earlier blows, but its aspirations to exert near monopolistic control over entire sectors of the city's economy were checked. New ventures had to be smaller, more fragmented, less obviously dependent on control over physical choke points. Younger members and associates entering the organization in the late 1990s and 2000s would have heard about the days when figures like Ali Shades could influence which hauler picked up from which building or which truck backed into which dock at Fulton. But those stories would have been told as part of a vanished past, a cautionary tale about attracting too much regulatory attention. In this way, Malangon's career came to mark, in hindsight, the end of a certain model of mafia power in New York. Earlier generations had built their fortunes on vice, muscle, and the manipulation of political machines. His cohort extended that influence into the day-to-day infrastructure of the city. The response, long delayed but ultimately forceful, combined new legal concepts, undercover techniques, and structural reforms. Once deployed, that response made it difficult for anyone to replicate his path. There would still be corruption, still be organized violence, but the specific synthesis he embodied, of neighborhood credibility, industry expertise, and unchallenged control over basic services, became far harder to achieve. For those who study urban history, his story also serves as a reminder of how late some of these reforms came. The Fulton fish market had been in operation for more than a century before the full extent of its capture by a criminal organization was exposed. The commercial carding cartel had been quietly shaping bills and contracts for decades by the time the undercover operation began. That lag raises questions about how many other sectors, in how many other cities, may still harbor similar hidden arrangements. The lesson drawn from the Malangon era is not a comforting one, that organized crime has been definitively defeated, but a more demanding one, that institutions must be willing to look critically at the most ordinary corners of economic life, precisely because those corners can be so easily overlooked. Alphonse Ali Shades, Malangon did not set out, as a young man in mid-century New York, to become a symbol in debates about governance, regulation, and the sociology of crime. He entered adulthood in a world where the mafia's presence in certain neighborhoods and industries was taken for granted, and he rose by learning how to navigate and profit from that presence. Decades later, the patterns of behavior that had once seemed to him like the natural order of things were redefined by law and public opinion as unacceptable distortions of the market and abuses of power. His personal trajectory, from obscure neighborhood associate to indicted Genovese capo, from quiet influence to public conviction, encapsulates that transformation. When, in the end, his name appeared on a whiteboard in a training room or in a footnote of an academic article, It did so as part of a larger story about how cities learn from their own vulnerabilities. The man behind the sunglasses, who once moved confidently through a tightly controlled world of trash routes and fish stalls, became a reference point for how not to let such control take root again. In that sense, the enduring impact of his life is measured less in the years he spent in prison or the specific rackets he oversaw, and more in the changes that followed. The new rules, the new watchdogs, and the new skepticism toward any arrangement that relies too heavily on unwritten understandings among a select few. By the opening decades of the 21st century, the world that had once revolved around men like Alphonse, Ali Shades, Malangon existed largely in memory and in the paper trails of old court files. The Fulton fish market no longer lined the East River with its damp sheds and neon signs. The name now referred to a refrigerated complex at Hunts Point, tucked into the Bronx's sprawling food distribution district. The private carting trucks that rolled through the city streets still collected restaurants and offices' trash, but their owners had passed through a licensing process that would have been unimaginable when Malangon was in his prime. For most New Yorkers going about their days, the idea that the Mafia had once quietly dictated who could pick up whose garbage, and at what price, was a half-forgotten story from another era. Yet in certain circles, in regulatory offices, police academies, law schools, and among historians of organized crime, the name Ali Shades remained a point of reference. Not because of any personal flamboyance or notorious act of violence, but because his career marked a junction between three trajectories: the rise and entrenchment of the American Mafia in the mid-20th century, the transformation of New York's economic life, and the gradual development of legal and institutional tools capable of attacking criminal influence at its roots. The industries in which he had exercised influence offer a kind of running measure of that transformation. In commercial waste, the city's regulator continued, year after year, to review license applications from hauling companies and their principals. Background checks went beyond credit scores and safety violations to examine any past associations with individuals identified in organized crime cases, including those who had taken guilty pleas in the trash cartel prosecutions. When applications were denied or conditioned on stricter oversight, the written decisions sometimes cited the historical domination of this industry by organized crime families, pointing directly back to the period when Malangon acted as a Genovese emissary in carting. The message was less about him personally and more about the system he represented. By memorializing the old cartel's methods, territorial property rights, long-term contracts that locked in customers, associations used to police competition, regulators sought to create a permanent institutional memory. The hope was that no future official would be able to say, as many had in earlier decades, that they simply did not know how deeply crime families could penetrate an ordinary city service. In that sense, the prosecutions that had carried his name on their caption pages became part of the city's regulatory DNA. At Hunts Point, the fish market's new home, similar efforts continued. The market's management and city oversight bodies kept up licensing and background check regimes designed to keep out individuals with clear organized crime ties. Periodic enforcement actions, some involving alleged bid rigging or side deals, though typically on a smaller scale than the old Fulton days, were often justified explicitly as necessary to prevent a return to the conditions exposed in the 1990s. Those conditions, spelled out in indictments that had featured Malangon as a key defendant, remained the cautionary baseline against which current behavior was measured. For all the institutional weight his name carried in these contexts, however, Malangon himself largely disappeared from public view after his release. No major new indictments bearing his name surfaced in the decades that followed his prison term. Journalists who revisited the cartel story noted the sentences he had received and the reforms that followed, but they had little to say about his later life. To neighbors, He would have been an elderly man with a past. To the larger city, a figure who appeared chiefly in the context of archival footage and historical summaries. This retreat into obscurity, after a period of notoriety, is typical of many mid- and upper-level organized crime figures whose careers peak before the age of ubiquitous digital documentation. Their working lives are recorded in surveillance logs, undercover transcripts, and court exhibits more than in interviews or autobiographies. When they step away from the structures that once sustained their influence, whether by choice, by force of law, or by age, there is often little public trace of the transition. For historians, this creates a one-sided record, rich in institutional detail about what they did, but nearly silent on how they understood their own arc. In Malangon's case, the surviving record lets us see the outlines of a typical day in his working years only obliquely. We glimpse him through associates, accounts, arriving at an association office to help settle a dispute between haulers, taking calls from market figures about which trucking company would handle which routes, conferring with other Genovese representatives about profit sharing or responses to perceived slights. These were not cinematic episodes, but moments of routine management. The harm, as judges later emphasized, came less from any single incident than from the accumulation of thousands of such decisions over time. That cumulative harm is easiest to grasp at the level of the small business owner, the restaurant, bakery, or shop, whose trash bills and delivery costs were quietly inflated by the cartel's unwritten rules. For those owners, the impact might have meant narrower margins, delayed investments, or the need to raise prices for customers. A single contract viewed in isolation might not have seemed egregious. It was only in comparison to what a competitive market would have charged, and in recognition of the barriers placed in front of independent competitors, that the full scale of the mob tax became visible. Seen from that perspective, the underworld authority exercised by Malangon and his colleagues did not just enrich a closed circle. It helped shape the broader cost structure of doing business in New York. In effect, their decisions redistributed wealth from many to few, not through a formal tax system accountable to voters, but through fear, habit, and the practical knowledge that challenging the system carried risks. The victims were often too diffuse and too busy surviving day to day to name themselves as such. It would be years before investigative reporters and prosecutors assembled their stories into a coherent picture. In the documentary and scholarly accounts that later took up his story, this structural dimension became central. Filmmakers and authors who wanted to explain why cases like the trash cartel prosecution mattered had to move beyond the familiar tropes of mafia storytelling, family drama, personal loyalty, spectacular crimes, and focus on how a criminal organization could reshape an entire sector of the economy without ever issuing a public decree. Malangon's reserved demeanor and businesslike presentation actually fit this narrative better than a flashier persona would have. He embodied a type of mob figure for whom the primary arena of action was not the street corner or the back alley, but the trade association office and the informal conference over coffee. This image challenged some of the lingering cultural mythology around the mafia. Popular culture had long oscillated between demonization and romanticization, portraying mobsters either as ruthless villains or as anti-heroes bound by an alternative code of honor. The reality of the carting and fish market rackets, as documented in cases involving alley shades, undercut both extremes. Here were men who did not advertise themselves as rebels or avengers, but as problem solvers. Their solutions depended on the shadow of potential harm, yet the day-to-day business of maintaining their power often looked, on the surface, like ordinary negotiation and administration. Legal scholars drew on this reality to argue for a wider understanding of coercion and complicity. In articles and conferences, they examined how systems like the trash cartel relied not only on overt threats, but on softer forms of pressure, expectations transmitted through industry, rules, social networks that made it difficult for carting companies or market workers to stand apart, and a widespread sense that appealing to formal authorities would be futile or dangerous. Figures such as Malangon were not always the ones delivering the hardest messages, but they were key to ensuring that these subtler mechanisms stayed in place. From a sociological standpoint, his trajectory also offered insight into the processes by which individuals come to occupy such roles. Born into an Italian-American milieu in mid-century New York, he grew up amid overlapping layers of identity: family, parish, neighborhood, and the informal order enforced by men associated with the old crime families. Opportunities for advancement were unevenly distributed. Discrimination and limited access to elite education steered many into manual trades where, as he discovered, the presence of the underworld was strong. The decision to move from the orbit of that presence into active participation was his, but it occurred within a context where the boundaries between legitimacy and criminality were often blurred in practice. This does not absolve. It contextualizes. Prosecutors, in their closing arguments, never claimed that structural factors forced him into crime. They argued instead that he had taken advantage of those structures and of his community's trust to pursue a path that harmed many others. But for historians, the interplay between individual agency and social environment remains essential to understanding why the Genovese and other families were able to recruit and retain people with the skills necessary to run complex rackets like the trash cartel for so long. In the broader arc of Mafia history, his career sits in a phase of consolidation and institutionalization. The bloody struggles that defined the emergence of the modern families in the 1920s and 1930s were long past by the time he assumed responsibility in the carting and market sectors. So too were the most open displays of power, public meetings of bosses, conspicuous entourages that had drawn attention in the 1950s and 1960s. The strategy by then was to become so entwined with the everyday functioning of certain industries that dislodging the underworld presence would be costly and disruptive. In that task, someone like Malangon, who could move easily in both criminal and ostensibly legitimate circles, was an asset. His fall, conversely, was emblematic of the state's shift from sporadic crackdowns to systemic interventions. The operations that targeted the trash cartel and the Fulton fish market were not responses to single sensational incidents. They were the product of multi-year plans aimed at collecting enough evidence to prove the existence of ongoing criminal enterprises. They used tools, RICO, enterprise corruption statutes, sophisticated undercover operations, that earlier generations of law enforcement had either lacked or been hesitant to deploy. In that sense, the legal defeats he suffered were as much about the maturation of anti-racketeering strategies as they were about any change in the behavior of the underworld. By the time those strategies reached full force in the 1990s, Malangon was already an older man. The years under indictment and then in custody were, in terms of age, years in which many people begin to withdraw from demanding work, even in legitimate occupations. That timing undoubtedly shaped the remainder of his life. When he left prison, the likelihood of him rebuilding a substantial role in organized crime in a city transformed by new laws and new economic conditions was slim. The Genovese family, like other mafia organizations, still existed, but it operated in a more fragmented, constantly monitored landscape. What remains most tangible of his legacy, then, are the systems whose existence and dismantling his name helps us trace. Ask a restaurant owner today to describe their relationship with their trash hauler, and they are more likely to mention comparative bids and service reviews than shadowy warnings about which company they are allowed to use. Talk to merchants at Hunts Point, and while complaints about rents and regulations are plentiful, as they are in any market, the language of fear surrounding market bosses is notably diminished from the Fulton days. These changes cannot be attributed to the prosecution of any single figure, but his case was among those that shifted the balance. In the end, the life of Alphonse Ali Shades Malangone illustrates how organized crime can be both intimately personal and broadly structural. On one level, it is the story of a boy from a particular neighborhood who grew into a man wielding quiet power over essential city services, then lost that power and his freedom in the face of a determined legal challenge. On another, it is a window onto the ways in which criminal organizations adapt themselves to the contours of legitimate economies, exploiting gaps in regulation and social trust, and onto the counter-adaptations by states and cities that eventually make such careers harder to sustain. For those who knew him only as a name in an indictment or a face behind dark glasses on the courthouse steps, he may seem like just one more mid-level mafioso in a long line stretching across the 20th century. But when we follow the threads of his involvement, from the crowded post-war streets where he first saw how power operated, through the smoke-filled association rooms where carding routes were parceled out, to the stark fluorescent light of the courtroom where prosecutors laid bare the mechanics of the garbage cartel, we see more than an individual biography. We see a pattern of opportunity and exploitation, of silence and exposure, of institutions slow to recognize how deeply they have been compromised, and then, at last, determined to repair themselves. The trucks still roll before dawn, and the markets still wake in the half-light to receive the city's food. Their movements now are governed by ordinances and contracts shaped, in part, by lessons drawn from the era of Ali Shades. In that ongoing motion, his story persists as a caution and as a measure of change, a reminder of how far the influence of organized crime once reached into the ordinary fabric of New York, and of the long, often difficult work required to pull it back into the open and subject it to the rule of law.